All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. We're on Changing Economic Patterns still on page 535, the economic factors. But before I get started, you should check out this channel the past 33 years. They got some insane type of videos going on over there, kind of conspiracy type of videos. So check them out, link in the description below, as well as the link to Tragedy and Hope. All right, on page 535, the economic factors. From an analytical point of view, there are a number of important elements in the economic situation of the 20th century. These elements did not all come into existence at the same time, nor did any single one come into existence everywhere simultaneously. The order in which these elements came into existence is roughly that in which we list them here. Rising standard of living, industrialism, growth of size of enterprises, dispersal of ownership of enterprises, separation of control from ownership, concentration of control, decline of competition, increasing disparity in distribution of incomes, declining rate of expansion leading to crisis. Okay. 1. A rise in the general or average standard of living in modern times is obvious and, with intermittent breaks, goes back for 1,000 years. Such progress is welcome, but it obviously brings with it certain accompanying factors which must be understood and accepted. A rising standard of living, except in its earliest stages, does not involve any increase in consumption of necessities, but instead involves an increase in the consumption of luxuries, even to the point of replacing basic necessities by luxuries. As average incomes rise, people do not, after a certain level, eat more and more black bread, potatoes, and cabbage, or wear more and more clothing. Instead, they replace black bread with wheaten bread and eat meat. And add meat to their diet and replace coarse clothing by finer apparel. They shift their emphasis from energy foods to protective foods. This process can be continued indefinitely. A number of students have divided goods from this point of view into 3 levels: A. Necessities, B. Industrial products, and C. Luxuries and services. The first would include food and clothing, the second would include railroads, automobiles, and radios, the third would include movies, books, amusements, yachts, leisure, music, philosophy, and so on. Naturally, the dividing lines between the 3 groups are very vague, and the position of any particular item will vary from society to society and even from person to person. As standards of living rise, decreasing proportions of attention and resources are devoted to primary or secondary types of products and increasing proportions to secondary and tertiary types of products. This has very important economic consequences. It means that luxuries tend to become relatively more important than necessities. It also means that attention is constantly being shifted from products for which the demand is relatively inelastic to products for which the demand is relatively elastic, that is, expansible. There are exceptions to this. For example, housing, which is obviously a necessity, is a product for which demand is fairly elastic and might continue to be so until most persons lived in places, but on the whole, the demand for necessities is less elastic than the demand for luxuries. A rising standard of living also means an increase in savings or accumulation of surplus out of all proportion to the rise in incomes. It is a fairly general rule both for societies and for individuals that savings go up faster than incomes as the latter rise, if for no other reason than the fact that a person with an adequate supply of necessities will take time to make up his mind on which luxuries he will expend any increase in income. Finally, a shift from primary to secondary production usually entails a very great increase in capital investment, while a shift from secondary to tertiary production may not result in any increase in capital investment proportionately as great. Leisure, amusement, music, philosophy, education, and personal services are not likely to require capital investments comparable to those required by the construction of railroads, steel factories, automotive plants, and electrical stations. As a result of these factors, it may well arise that a society whose rising standard of living have brought it to the point where it is passing from emphasis on secondary to emphasis on tertiary production will be faced with the necessity of adjusting itself to a situation which includes more emphasis on luxuries than on necessities, more attention to products of elastic demand than inelastic, and increased savings with decreased demand for investment. 2. Industrialization is an obvious element in modern economic development. As used here, it has a very specific meaning, namely, the application of inanimate power to production. For long ages, production was made by using power from animate sources such as human bodies, slaves, or draft animals, with relatively little accomplished by power from such inanimate sources as wind or falling water. The so-called Industrial Revolution began when the energy from coal, released through a non-living machine, the steam engine, became an important element in the productive process. It continued through improvements in the use of wind power and water power to the use of oil in internal combustion engines, and finally to the power from atomic sources. The essential aspect of industrialism has been the great rise in the use of energy per capita of population. No adequate figures were available for most European countries, but in the United States, the energy used per capita was, and it's got a chart on page 537 showing how it's increasing. As a result of this increase in the use of energy per capita, industrial output per man-hour rose significantly in the United States 96% from 1899 to 1929. It was this increase in output per man-hour which permitted the rise in standards of living and the increases in investment associated with the process of industrialization. All parts of any single country at the same moment the Industrial Revolution did not reach all parts of Europe or even all parts of any single country at the same moment. In general, it began in England late in the 18th century, about 1776, and spread slowly eastward and southward across Europe, reaching France after 1830, Germany after 1850, Italy and Russia after 1890. This eastward movement of industrialism had many significant results, among them the belief on the part of the newer countries that they were at a disadvantage in comparison with England because of the latter's head start. This was untrue, for, from a strictly temporal point of view, these newer countries had an advantage over England, since their newer industrial installations were less obsolescent and less hampered by vested interest. Whatever advantage England had arose from better natural resources, more plentiful supply of capital, and skilled labor. 3. The growth of size of enterprise was a natural result of the process of industrialism. This process required very considerable outlays for fixed capital, especially in the activities most closely associated with the early stages of industrialism, such as railroads, iron foundries, and textile mills. Such great outlays required a new legal structure for enterprise. This was found in the corporation or limited liability joint stock company. In this company, large capital installations could be constructed and run with ownership divided into small fractions among a large number of persons. This increase in size of unit was apparent in all countries, but chiefly in the United States, Britain, and Germany. The statistics on this are incomplete and tricky to use, but in general, they indicate that while the number of corporations has been increasing and the average size of all corporations has been falling, the absolute size of the largest corporation has been increasing rapidly in the 20th century, and the share of total assets or of total output held by the largest corporations has been rising. As a result, the output of certain products, notably chemicals, metals, artificial fibers, electrical equipment, and so on, has been dominated in most countries by a few great firms. In the United States, where this process has been studied most carefully, it was found that from 1909 to 1930, the number of billion-dollar corporations rose from 1 to 15, and the share of all corporation assets held by the 200 largest rose from 32% to over 49%. By 1939, this figure reached 57%. This meant that the largest 200 corporations were growing faster than other corporations, 5.4% a year compared to 2% a year, and faster than total national wealth. As a result, by 1930, these 200 largest corporations had 49.2% of all corporate assets, or 81 billion out of 165 billion. They had 38% of all business wealth, or 81 billion out of 212 billion. They held 22% of all wealth in the country, 81 billion. In fact, in 1930, a single corporation, American Telephone and Telegraph, AT&T, had greater assets than the total wealth in 21 states. No such figures are available for European countries, but there can be no doubt that similar growth was taking place in most of them during this period. 4. Dispersal of ownership of enterprise was a natural result of the growth of enterprise and was made possible by the corporate method of organization. As corporations increased in size, it became less and less possible for any individual or small group to own any important fractions of their stocks. In most countries, the numbers of security holders increased faster than the number of outstanding securities. In the United States, the former increased in numbers 7 times as fast as the latter from 1900 to 1928. This was a greater spread than in other countries, but elsewhere there was also a considerable spreading out of corporate ownership. This was exactly contrary to the prediction of Karl Marx that the owners of industry would get fewer and fewer as well as richer and richer. 5. The separation of ownership from control has already been mentioned. It was an inevitable counterpart of the advent of the corporate form of business organization. Indeed, the corporate form was devised for this very purpose, that is, to mobilize the capital owned by many persons into a single enterprise controlled by a few. As we have seen, this inevitable counterpart was carried to quite an unexpected degree by the devices invented by financial capitalism. 6. The concentration of control was also inevitable in the long run, but here also was carried by special devices to an extraordinary degree. As a result, in highly industrialized countries, the economic systems were dominated by a handful of industrial complexes. The French economy was dominated by 3 powers, Rothschild, Mirabaud, and Schneider. The German economy was dominated by 2, I.G. Farben and Verenig Stahlwerk. I don't know how to pronounce that. The United States was dominated by 2, Morgan and Rockefeller. Other countries like Italy or Britain were dominated by somewhat larger numbers. In no country was the power of these great complexes paramount and exclusive, and in no country were these powers able to control the situation to such a degree that they were able to prevent their own decline under the impact of world political and economic conditions, but their ability to dominate their spheres is undeniable. In France, Rothschild and Schneider were not able to weather the assault of Hitler. In Germany, Thyssen was not able to withstand the attacks of Flick and Goring. In the United States, Morgan was unable to prevent the economic swing from financial to monopoly capitalism and yielded quite gracefully to the rising power of DuPont. In Britain, likewise, the masters of financial capitalism yielded to the masters of chemical products and vegetable oils once the inevitable writing on the wall had been traced out in a convincing fashion. But all these shifts of power within the individual economic systems indicate merely that individuals or groups are unable to maintain their positions in the complex flux of modern life and do not indicate any decentralization of control. On the contrary, even as group succeeds group, the concentration of control becomes greater. 7. A decline in competition is a natural consequence of the concentration of control. This decline in competition, of course, refers only to price competition in the market, since this was the mechanism which made the economic system function in the 19th century. This decline is evident to all students of modern economics and is one of the most widely discussed aspects of the modern economic system. It is caused not only by the activities of businessmen, but also by the actions of labor unions, of governments, of private social welfare organizations, and even of the herd-like behavior of consumers themselves. 8. The increasing disparity in the distribution of income is the most controversial and least well-established characteristic of the system. The available statistical evidence is so inadequate in all European countries that the characteristic itself cannot be proved conclusively. An extensive study of the subject using the available materials for both Europe and the United States, with a careful analysis of the much better American materials, will permit the following tentative conclusions. Leaving aside all government action, it would appear that the disparity in the distribution of national income has been getting wider. In the United States, for example, according to the National Industrial Conference Board, the richest one-fifth of the population received 46.2% of the national income in 1910, 51% in 1929, and 48% in 1937. In the same 3 years, the share of the poorest one-fifth of the population fell from 8.3% to 5.4% to 3.6%. Thus, the ratios between the portion obtained by the richest one-fifth and that obtained by the poorest one-fifth increased in these 3 years from 5 to 6, from 9 to 3, and from 13 to 5. If instead of one-fifths, we examine the ratio between the percentage obtained by the richest one-tenth and that obtained by the poorest one-tenth, we find that in 1910 the ratio was 10, in 1929 it was 21 to 7, in 1937 it was 34 to 4. This means that the rich in the United States were getting richer relatively and probably absolutely, while the poor were getting poorer both relatively and absolutely. This last is caused by the fact that the increase in the real national income in the period 1910 to 1937 was not great enough to compensate for the decrease in percentage going to the poor or for the increase in numbers of persons in that class. As a result of such an increase in disparity in the distribution of national income, there will be a tendency for savings to rise and for consumers' purchasing power to decline relative to each other. This is because the savings of a community are largely made by the richer persons in it, and savings increase of all proportion as income rises. On the other hand, the incomes of the poor class are devoted primarily as expenditures for consumption. Thus, if it is correct that there is an increasing disparity in the distribution of the national income of a country, there will be a tendency for savings to rise and consumer purchasing power to decline relatively to each other. If this is so, there will be an increasing reluctance on the part of the controllers of savings to invest their savings in new capital equipment, since the existing decline of purchasing power will make it increasingly difficult to sell the products of the existing capital equipment, and highly unlikely that the products of any new capital equipment could be sold more easily. This situation, as we have described it, assumes that the government has not intervened in such a way as to change the distribution of the national income as determined by economic factors. If, however, the government does intervene to disturb this distribution, its actions will either increase the disparity in its distribution or will decrease it. If these actions increase it, the problem of the discrepancy to which we have referred between savings on one hand and the level of purchasing power and investment on the other will be made worse. If, on the other hand, the government adopts a program which seeks to reduce the disparity in the distribution of the national income by, for example, adopting a program of taxation which reduces the savings of the rich while increasing the purchasing power of the poor, the same problem of insufficient investment will arise. Such a tax program, as we have described, would have to be based on a graduated income tax, and because of the concentration of savings in the upper income brackets, would have to be carried to such a sharp degree of graduation that the taxes of the very rich would be rapidly approaching the levels of confiscation. This would, as the conservatives say, kill incentive. Of this, there can be no doubt, for any person with an income already large enough to satisfy his customers' wants will be very unlikely to possess any incentive to invest if each dollar of profit made from such investments is to have all but a few cents of its value taken by the government in the form of taxation. In this way, the problem of increasing disparity in the distribution of national income leads to a single result: decline of investment relative to savings. Whether the situation is left subject to purely economic factors or the government takes steps to decrease the disparity, the only difference is that in the one case, the decline in investment may be attributed to a lack of consumer purchasing power, while in the other case, it may be attributed to a killing of incentive by government actions. Thus, we see that the controversy, which has raged in both Europe and the United States since 1932 between progressives and conservatives in regard to the causes of the lack of investment, is an artificial one. The progressives, who insisted that the lack of investment was caused by lack of consumer purchasing power, were correct. But the conservatives, who insisted that the lack of investment was caused by a lack of confidence, were also correct. Each was looking at the opposite side of what is a single continuous cycle. This cycle runs roughly as follows. A. Purchasing power creates demand for goods. B. Demand for goods creates confidence in the minds of investors. C. Confidence creates new investments. And D. New investments create purchasing power, which then creates demand, and so on. To cut this cycle at any point and to insist that the cycle begins at that point is to falsify the situation. In the 1930s, the progressives concentrated attention on stage A, while the conservatives concentrated attention on stage C. The progressives, who sought to increase purchasing power by some redistribution of the national income, undoubtedly did increase purchasing power under stage A, but they lost purchasing power under Stage C by reducing confidence of potential investors. This decrease of confidence was especially noticeable in countries like France and the United States, which were still deeply involved in the stage of financial capitalism. It would appear that economic factors alone affected the distribution of incomes in the direction of increasing disparity. In no major country, however, were the economic factors alone allowed to determine the issue. In all countries, government action noticeably influenced the distribution. However, this influence was not usually the result of conscious desire to change the distribution of the national income. In Italy, the economic factors had relatively free rein until after the creation of the corporative state in 1934. The effect of government action was to increase the normal economic tendency towards an increasing disparity in distribution of the national income. This tendency had been allowed to work from an early period until the end of the war in 1918. A drastic effort by leftish influencers in the period 1918 to 1922 resulted in government action which reversed this tendency. As a result, a counter-revolution brought Mussolini to power in October 1922. The new government suppressed those government actions which had hampered the normal economic tendency, and as a result, the trend towards greater disparity in distribution of the national income was resumed. This trend became more drastic after the creation of the dictatorship in 1925, after the stabilization of the lira in 1927, and after the creation of the corporative state in 1934. In Germany, the changes in distribution of the national income were similar to those in Italy, although complicated by the efforts to create a social service state, an effort going back to Bismarck, and by the hyperinflation. In general, the trend toward increasing disparity in distribution of the national income continued less rapidly than in Italy until after 1918. The inflation, by wiping out unemployment for the lower class and by wiping out the savings of the middle class, created a complex situation in which the wealth of the richest class was increased while the poverty of the poorest class was reduced, and the general trend towards increased disparity in income was probably reduced. This reduction became greater under the social service state of 1924 to 1930, but was drastically reversed because of the great increase in poverty in the lower classes after 1929. After 1934, the adoption of an unorthodox financial policy and a policy of benefits to monopoly capitalism reinforced the normal trend towards increasing disparity in distribution of income. This was in accord with the desires of the Hitler government, but the full impact of this policy was not apparent on the distribution of incomes until the period of full employment after 1937. Until 1938, Hitler's policy, although aimed at favoring the high-income classes, raised the standards of living of the lower income levels even more drastically, by shifting them from unemployment with incomes close to nothing into wage-earning positions in industry, so that the disparity in distribution of income was probably even reduced for a short-run period in 1934 to 1937. This was not unacceptable to the high-income classes because it stopped the threat of revolution by the discontented masses and because it was obviously of long-run benefit to them. This long-run benefit began to appear when capacity employment of capital and labor was achieved in 1937. The continuance of the policy of rearmament after 1937 increased the incomes of the high-income groups while decreasing the incomes of the lower-income groups, and thus served from 1937 onward to reinforce the normal economic tendency towards an increasing disparity in the distribution of incomes. This, of course, is one of the essential features of a fascist government and is obvious not only in Germany since 1937, in Italy since 1927, but also in Spain since 1938. In France and Britain, the trend towards increasing disparity in the distribution of incomes was reversed in recent decades, although in Britain before 1945 and in France before 1936, there was no conscious effort to achieve this result. In France, disparity increased until 1913, then decreased chiefly because of the increasing power of labor unions and actions of government. The inflation and resulting devaluation badly injured the incomes of the possessing class so that the disparity became less dispersed, but the whole level of living standards was declining, savings were declining, and investment was decreasing more rapidly than either. This process became worse after the Depression hit France about 1931, and even worse after the Popular Front adopted its welfare program in 1936. This decline of the general economic level continued quite steadily except for a brief revival after 1938, but the disparity in the distribution of incomes very likely became greater in 1940 to 1942. In Britain, the disparity became greater, but at a slower rate because of the labor unions until the First World War, and then almost stabilized, increasing only slightly because of the severe efforts made in Britain to pay for much of the war's cost by taxation. The decrease in upper level incomes by taxation, however, was more than overcome by the decrease in lower level incomes from unemployment. This static condition of the disparity in distribution of the national income doubtless continued this static condition of the disparity in the distribution of the national income doubtless continued until after 1931. It's on page 544. It's supposed to be doubtlessly. This book is written horribly. This static condition of the disparity in distribution of the national incomes doubtlessly continued until 1931. Since this last date, the situation is confused. The revival of prosperity and the rapid development of new lines of activity combined with the peculiarities of the indecine of British taxation. Of the indecine? With the peculiarities of the indecine of British taxation have likely reduced the disparity, but until 1934, not by anything approaching the degree which one might expect from a first glance at the problem. God, these sentences are retarded. Since 1934, and especially since 1946, the tax Since 1934, and especially since 1946, the tax schedule and the government's social welfare program have drastically reduced the disparity in distribution of income and have also cut investment and even savings by private sources to a considerable degree. It would seem that in the 20th century, the disparity in the distribution of national income, which had been increasing for generations, slowed down and reversed as a result of government activities. This turning point appeared in different countries at different dates, probably earliest in Denmark and France, later in Germany and Italy, latest in Britain and Spain. In France and Britain, the tendency was reversed by the action of the government, but in a hesitant fashion, which was not able in any decisive way to overcome the sag in private enterprise by any upswing in government enterprise. In Germany, Italy, and Spain, the governments fell into the hands of the possessing classes, and the desires of the people of these countries for a more equitable distribution of incomes were frustrated. In all three types of conditions, there was a decline in real economic progress after 1950. 9. A declining rate of economic expansion is the last important characteristic of the economic system of Europe in the present century up to 1950. This decline resulted almost inevitably from the other characteristics which we have already discussed. It varied from country to country, the countries of Eastern Europe suffering less than those of Western Europe on the whole, but chiefly because their previous rate of progress had been so much lower. The causes of this decline are basically to be found in a relative increase in the power of the vested interest within the community to defend the status quo against the efforts of the progressive and enterprising members of the community to change it. This was revealed in the market, the central mechanism of the economic system, as a result of the relative increase in savings in respect to investment. Savings have continued or have increased for several reasons. In the first place, a tradition which placed a high social esteem on savings existed in Western Europe from the Protestant Reformation until the 1930s. In the second place, there had grown up established institutionalized savings organizations like insurance companies. In the third place, the rising standard of living increased savings even more rapidly. In the fourth place, the increasing disparity in the distribution of incomes increased savings. In the fifth place, the increase in size of enterprises and the separation of ownership from control acted to increase the amount of corporate savings, undistributed profits. On the other hand, the inclination to invest did not rise so rapidly as savings or even decreased. Here, again, the reasons are numerous. In the first place, the shift in advanced industrial countries from secondary to tertiary production reduces the demand for heavy capital investment. In the second place, declining rates of population increase and geographic expansion may adversely affect the demand for investment. In the third place, the increasing disparity in the distribution of incomes, whether it is counteracted by government action or not, has a tendency to reduce the demand for investment capital. In the fourth place, the decrease in competition has served to reduce the amount of investment by making it possible for the controllers of existing capital to maintain its value by curtailing the investment of new capital, which would make the existing capital less valuable. This last point may require additional explanation. Not really, it's called cockblocking. In the past, investment was not only capital creating but also capital destroying. That is, it made some existing capital worthless by making it obsolete. The creation by investment, for example, of shipyards for making iron hull steam vessels, not only created this new capital but at the same time destroyed the value of existing yards equipped to make wooden hull sailing ships. In the past, new investment was made only in one of two cases. A, if an old investor believed that the new capital would yield sufficient profit to pay for itself and for the old investment now made obsolete, or B, if the new investor was completely free of the old one so that the latter could do nothing to prevent the destruction of his existing capital holdings by the new investor. Both of these two alternatives in the 20th century tended to become less likely until 1950, the former by the decline in consumer purchasing power and the latter by the decrease in competition. The way in which the relative decline of investment in respect to savings results in economic crisis is not difficult to see. In the modern economic community, the sum total of goods and services appearing in the markets is at one and the same time the income of the community and the aggregate cost of producing the goods and services in question. The sums expended by the entrepreneur on wages, rents, salaries, raw materials, interest, lawyers' fees, and so on represent cost to him and income to those who receive them. His own profits also enter the picture, since they are his income and the cost of persuading him to produce the wealth in question. The goods are offered for sale at a price which is equal to the sum of all costs, including profits. In the community as a whole, aggregate cost, aggregate incomes, and aggregate prices are the same, since they are merely opposite sides of the identical expenditures. The purchasing power available in the community is equal to income minus savings. If there are any savings, the available purchasing power will be less than the aggregate prices being asked for the products for sale and by the amount of the savings. Thus, all the goods and services produced cannot be sold as long as savings are held back. In order for all the goods to be sold, it is necessary for the savings to reappear in the market as purchasing power. The usual way in which this is done is by investment. When savings are invested, they are expended into the community and appear as purchasing power. Since the capital good made by the process of investment is not offered for sale to the community, the expenditures made by its creation appear completely as purchasing power. Thus, the disequilibrium between purchasing power and prices, which was created by the act of saving, is restored completely by the act of investment, and all goods can be sold at the prices asked. But whenever investment is less than savings, the available supply of purchasing power is inadequate by the same amount to buy the goods being offered. This margin by which the purchasing power is inadequate because of an excess of savings over investment may be called the deflationary gap. This deflationary gap is the key to the 20th century economic crisis and one of the three central cores of which the whole tragedy of the century. Okay, so basically what he's saying there is that because of that, like, whatever M0 level money where the rich people just store all their money in savings and they never actually spend it, that's what's causing the deflation. The fact that basically that once you reach a certain level of wealth or income, whatever you want to call it, right, you don't have to spend more money. Once you can only eat so much food in a day. You can only sleep so many hours a day. You can only travel so far per day, right? So even if they get like luxury cars and luxury beds and luxury food, they still have money to save. Where like poor people work paycheck to paycheck, live paycheck to paycheck, so they can't save money. So every time rich people save money, it decreases the purchasing power of poor people, right? So basically, and it's unavoidable because people are going to save their money once they are over whatever demands that they have, right? So it's like basically a self-perpetuating problem where rich people can just continually save money, decreasing the purchasing power of poor people, and then poor people have to go to work more in order to buy the same things that they were buying last week. So like 2 years ago, you only had to work 40 hours a week. Now you've got to work 45 hours a week to buy the same stuff, or maybe even less stuff. And then 10 years from now, you'll have to work 60 hours a week to buy less stuff than you bought 10 years ago working 45 hours a week, right? And until you can get past that point where you don't have to spend all your money and you can actually save some of it, then it's a self-perpetuating problem, right? Okay. All right. On page 546, The result of economic depression. The deflationary gap arising from a failure of investment to reach the level of savings can be closed either by lowering the supply of goods to the level of the available purchasing power or by raising the supply of purchasing power to a level able to absorb the existing supply of goods or by a combination of both. The first solution will give a stabilized economy on a low level of economic activity. The second will give a stabilized economy on a high level of economic activity. Left to itself, the economic system under modern conditions would adopt the former procedure. This would work roughly as follows. The existence of the deflationary gap, that is, available purchasing power less than aggregate prices of available goods and services, will result in falling prices, declining economic activity, and rising unemployment. All of this will result in a fall in national income, and this in turn will result in an even more rapid decline in the volume of savings. This decline continues until the volume of savings reaches the level of investment, at which point the fall is arrested and the economy becomes stabilized at a low level. As a matter of fact, this process did not work itself out in any industrial country during the Great Depression of 1929 to 1934 because the disparity in the distribution of national income was so great that a considerable portion of the population would have been driven to zero incomes and absolute want before the savings of the richer segment of the population fell to the level of investment. See, because basically the rich people never have to spend their money. And the poor people need the rich people to spend their money in order to have money. Moreover, as the Depression deepened, the level of investment declined even more rapidly than the level of savings. There can be little doubt that under such conditions the masses of the population would have been driven to revolution before the automatic economic factors were able to stabilize the economy, and the stabilization, if reached, would have been on a level so low that a considerable portion of the population would have been in absolute want. Because of this, in every industrial country, the government took steps to arrest the course of the Depression before their citizens were driven to desperation. The methods used to deal with the Depression and close the deflationary gap were of many different kinds, but all are reducible to two fundamental types: A, those which destroy goods, and B, those which produce goods which do not enter the market. The destruction of goods will close the deflationary gap by reducing the supply of unsold goods through lowering the supply of goods to the level of the supply of purchasing power. This is not generally realized that this method is one of the chief ways in which the gap is closed in a normal business cycle. In such a cycle, goods are destroyed by the simple expedient of not producing the good which the system is capable of producing. The failure to use the economic system at the 1929 level of output during the years 1930 to 1934 represented a loss of goods worth $1 billion in the United States, Britain, and Germany alone. This loss was equivalent to the destruction of such goods. Destruction of goods by failure to gather the harvest is a common phenomenon under the modern conditions, especially in respects to fruits, berries, and vegetables. When a farmer leaves his crop of oranges, peaches, or strawberries unharvested because the selling price is too low to cover the expense of harvesting, he is destroying the goods. Outright destruction of goods already produced is not common and occurred for the first time as a method of combating depression in the years 1930 to 1934. During this period, stores of coffee, sugar, and bananas were destroyed, corn was plowed under, and young livestock was slaughtered to reduce the supply on the market, similar to what happened during COVID. The destruction of goods in warfare is another example of this method of overcoming deflationary conditions in the economic system. That's what I said before about the military, how like making bombs is like the perfect capitalist like product because you just blow it up. The second method of filling the deflationary gap, namely by producing goods which do not enter the market, accomplishes its purpose by providing purchasing power in the market. Since the cost of production of such goods do not enter the market as purchasing power, while the goods themselves do not drain funds from the system if they are not offered for sale. New investment was the usual way in which this was accomplished in the normal business cycle, but it is not the normal way of filling the gap under modern conditions of depression. We have already seen the growing reluctance to invest and the unlikely chance that the purchasing power necessary for prosperity will be provided by a constant stream of private investment. If this is so, the funds for producing goods which do not enter the market must be sought in a program of public spending. Any program of public spending at once runs into the problems of inflation and public debt. These are the same two problems which were mentioned in an earlier chapter in connection with the efforts of government to pay for the First World War. The method of paying for a depression are exactly the same as the methods of paying for a war, except that the combination of methods used may be somewhat different because the goals are somewhat different. In financing a war, we should seek to achieve a method which will provide a maximum of output with a minimum of inflation and public debt. In dealing with a depression, since the chief aim is to close the deflationary gap, the goal will be to provide a maximum of output with a necessary degree of inflation and a minimum of public debt. Thus, the use of fiat money is more justifiable in financing a depression than in financing a war. Moreover, the selling of bonds to a private person in wartime might well be aimed at the lower income groups in order to reduce consumption and release facilities for war production, while in a depression, where low consumption is the chief problem, such sales of bonds to finance public spending would have to be aimed at the savings of the upper income groups. These ideas on the role of government spending in combating depression have been formally organized into the theory of compensatory economy. This theory advocates that government spending and fiscal policies be organized so that they work exactly contrary to the business cycle, with lower taxes and larger spending in a deflationary period and higher taxes with reduced spending in a boom period. The fiscal deficits of the down cycle would be counterbalanced in the national budget by the surplus of the up cycle. This compensatory economy has not been applied with much success in any European country except Sweden. In a democratic country, it would take the control of taxing and spending away from the elected representatives of the people and place this precious power of the purse at the control of the automatic process of the business cycle as interpreted by bureaucratic and unrepresented experts. That kind of sounds like the Treasury, though. Moreover, all these programs of deficit spending are in jeopardy in a country with a private banking system. In such a system, the creation of money or credit is usually reserved for the private banking institutions and is depreciated as a government action. And is deprecated as a government action. The argument that the creation of funds by the government is bad while the creation of funds by banks is salutary is very persuasive in a system based on traditional laissez-faire and in which the usual avenues of communications, such as newspapers and radios, are under private or even banker control. Public spending as a method of counteracting depression can vary very greatly in character, depending on the purposes of the spending. Spending for destruction of goods or for restriction of output, as under the early New Deal agricultural program, cannot be justified easily in a democratic country with freedom of communication because it obviously results in a decline in the national income and living standards. Spending for non productive monuments is somewhat easier to justify, but is hardly a long run solution. Spending for investments in productive equipment, like the Tennessee Valley Association, is obviously the best solution since it leads to an increase in national wealth and standards of living and is a long run solution, but it marks a permanent departure from a system of private capitalism and can be easily attacked in a country with capitalistic ideology and private banking system. Spending on armaments and national defense is the last method of fighting depression and is the one most readily and widely adopted in the 20th century. A program of public expenditure on armaments is a method for filling the deflationary gap and overcoming depression because it adds purchasing power to the market without drawing it out again later, since the armaments once produced are not put up for sale. From an economic point of view, this method of combating depression is not much different from the method listed earlier under destruction of goods, for in this case also, economic resources are diverted from constructive activities or idleness to production for destruction. The appeal of this method for coping with the problem of depression does not rest on economic grounds at all, for, on such grounds, there is no justification. Its appeal is rather to be found on other, especially political grounds. Among these grounds, we may list the following. A rearmament program helps heavy industry directly and immediately. Heavy industry is the segment of the economy which suffers earliest and most drastically in a depression, which absorbs manpower most readily, thus reducing unemployment, and which is politically influential in most countries. Such a program is also easily justified to the public on grounds of national defense, especially if other countries are dealing with their economic crises by the same methods of treatment. The adoption of rearmament as a method of combating depression does not have to be conscious. The country which adopts it may honestly feel that it is adopting the policy for good reasons, that it is threatened by aggression, and that a program of rearmament is necessary for political protection. It is very rare for a country consciously to adopt a program for aggression, for in most wars, both sides are convinced that their actions are defensive. It is almost equally rare for a country to adopt a policy of rearmament as a solution for depression, but unconsciously, the danger from a neighbor and the advantages to be derived from rearming in the face of such a danger are always more convincing to a country whose economic system is functioning below capacity than it is to a country which is riding a boom. Moreover, if a country adopts rearmament because of fear of another country's arms, and these last are the result of efforts to fill a deflationary gap, it can also be said that the rearmament of the former has a basic economic cause. All right, so that's the end of that section. The next section is pluralist economy and world blocks on page 550. All right, I think I'm just going to stop there. It's been about an hour. All right, so we can see that the United States basically was moving into what we are doing now, which is kind of like a just the stock market running everything basically, and we have to prop up the stock market, otherwise the entire economy will collapse. But then the stock market's supposed to be, investing in businesses and jobs to give jobs to low and middle class people, right? But then the rich people don't want to invest because the system is set up as, what do they call, like a K-shaped economy, where the rich keep getting richer, poor keep getting poorer. So if they invest in products to sell to poor people, while the poor people keep on getting poorer, then they lose confidence because they're like, well, we can't sell products to poor people. We can't sell expensive products to poor people. And the rich people already have all the products that they need or want or could ever even think of. And then so they don't want to invest. Poor people become unemployed, right? Then it causes more lack of confidence in the system, right? Then the rich people just hoard all their money until it gets to the point where they either feel like everyone's going to revolt on them or the system's just going to fall apart, basically because they're the only people in the system that have any money and everybody else has zero money. Then that's when the government steps in and either starts a war, starts printing money, or both. Usually both. They usually print money to start a war. And that's what saves them from that's how we save them from economic depression, right? That is the formula. Start a war when there's a depression. That's why everyone always says that. They always say, oh, well, whenever the money's about to go tits up, then the government starts a war. And this is the formula right here. So you can check out the PDF in the description below. Check out the past 33 years, link in the description below. Otherwise, I'm going to get out of here. Thanks for watching if you did. If you didn't, you won't hear this. So have a good day and peace.